Welcome to the Economic Rockstar Podcast with your host, Frank Conway, connecting brilliant minds in economics and finance.
Hello and welcome back to a new year, 2019, and I hope you have just as many great guests as I've had in the previous few years. And in this episode, I just want to reflect back on what was a great 2018 for the podcast and share some of what I felt were some great conversations I've had with economists. And I'm going to do this in two parts. This episode is going to be part one. And I'm going to follow a particular theme, one on looking at countries around the world and the work that some of the economists do in these countries and the communities that are affected by the local economy, whether it's due to customs, cultures or conflict, and also to try and knock some of our perceptions on some of these countries on the head so that we'll get to know some of the truths as to what these countries are actually like based on the experience of my guests who have spent some time there and have done a lot of research in those countries. And in this episode, I'm going to take excerpts from 10 previous episodes, and hopefully they'll follow a sequence in which one flows into the other based on the topic and the themes we're talking about. So first up, Jim Rogers on the opportunities in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Venezuela and North Korea. And some of the similar countries around the stands, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, that are growing from a low base, if you want to say a low GDP per capita base relative to neighbouring countries or the Western economies. And some people might see opportunities there. Do you see something similar? Or how did you experience your trip going through some of those countries?
Well, when I went through the first time, it was still part of the Soviet Union, so there weren't many great opportunities. I could see the potential, huge natural resources, and no debt. I mean, nobody would lend money to Joseph Stalin or to Nikita Khrushchev. Nobody would lend money to any of those ex-Soviet states. So there were opportunities, but not much I could do about it. The second time, of course, you could see that they'd gotten rid of communism and there were opportunities. Most of those countries did not have stock markets back then, and I mainly invest in stock markets. But Uzbekistan, which you mentioned, is been beaten down, ruined by the dictators. There's probably fantastic opportunities there, but not really stock market opportunities, and I mainly invest in markets. But sure, if you want to go to Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan, has gigantic opportunities right now for anybody who wants to go. And Kazakhstan actually has a stock market too. So if you want to go there and do it, North Korea, go to North Korea. North Korea is the most exciting country in the world right now, as far as I'm concerned. So go to North Korea, go to Venezuela.
Have you been to these countries?
Yeah, I've been to North Korea twice, been to Venezuela a few times, been to Kazakhstan at least 6 or 7 times. Yeah, but just because I've been there doesn't mean they're good investments. And I have not invested in Kazakhstan, but I certainly see plenty of opportunities for somebody who's not lazy and somebody who knows what they're doing.
Regarding North Korea, was it difficult to get entry into? Did you have to be interviewed? Did you have to fill out a lot of papers?
Well, the first time we were going, we had to fill out papers. Yeah, it's not like applying for a visa in America or something. Nothing that complicated. But we had permission, and then they closed it and said that there were problems in North Korea with the harvest, and so they weren't allowing people to come. But the next year, we did go. We filled out the papers, and everything went fine. There were no tourists there. We were essentially by ourselves, my wife and I, when we went. But we went to see they have something, they put on games every year, a gymnastic exhibition, which is the most extraordinary human scene I've ever seen. There's nothing quite like it. I mean, 100,000 people, and it's just astonishing what they can do. Of course, they don't have anything else to do in Kazakhstan. It's not as though they're going down to the beer hall and drinking all night or the disco or something. So, yes, it was not easy. We did get in. They canceled. Went the next year, and it was a great time. And then 2013, I went again. This time I went by myself because I was looking and still am looking for opportunities in North Korea. Unfortunately, at the moment, Americans are not allowed to go to North Korea. At least the U.S. government says they're not. And I don't want to fight the U.S. government. So it's difficult for me. But for people who are not U.S. citizens, I mean, my gosh, get on the next plane. You don't have to compete with the Americans. Wouldn't you like to invest in an economy where you don't have to compete with the Americans or the Japanese?
True.
Japanese are not allowed to go, nor the South Koreans. Three of the world's great competitors are out of the market. America, okay. Japan, and Korea, South Korea. So go. Very little competition.
So they'll welcome an Irishman.
They certainly would. By all means, you should go.
That's good advice, Jim. Because my sister is over in Hong Kong, and again, people there were suggesting to her, look into North Korea.
Well, I would suggest you get on the plane and go there. Not just look into it, go. I don't know what your sister is interested in or what she's knowledgeable about, but, go and open an Irish pub. You'll get rich. You'll be the first and only for a long time. You'll have a boom on your hands.
I'm laughing here, but that's the typical response that people may have. You said there that if the American debt has gone up 500% 10 years ago, you would have been laughed at. But in hindsight, looking back on it, maybe 10, 20 years time, if I look back on this conversation, I could say, Jim, you were 100% correct.
Well, I mean, I know I'm correct, but you try it out, and we can talk in 10 years. We can talk in 20 years. Korea, as it opens up, North Korea is where China was about 1980 or 81. It's it's just opening. It's opening slowly, but it's happening. It's too late for me to invest in China in 1981, but Korea is where China was then. And as Korea opens, an open Korea, united Korea, will be the most exciting country in the world because you have 80 million people right on the Chinese border, and the Northerners have huge natural resources, and they have disciplined, cheap, educated labor. Very cheap, educated, disciplined labor. You combine that with the South with massive amounts of capital and know-how and expertise right on the Chinese border. It's going to be fabulous. The Japanese are against it because the Japanese know they will not be able to compete with the United Korea. But, boy, it's going to be very exciting. So tell your sister to get on the next bus and go to North Korea.
Especially the way South Korea had evolved over the last number of decades. The approaches they took on when they developed some of their industries. Say, for example, they suggested to LG to move from textiles to TVs and so on, and that worked out for them extremely well. So if they apply fairly similar principles in the North, there could, as you suggested, a boom in terms of economic growth.
There's no question about that. As recently as 1970, North Korea was actually richer than South Korea. Communism ruins everything, and communism ruined North Korea. But it literally was richer than South Korea as recently as 40, 50 years ago. So now the two countries together have a great future.
This is episode 139 with Loretta Napoleoni on North Korea's growth prospects and how they can position themselves in the world economy.
I think the other obstacle, of course, is going to be how the regime is going to evolve. Because, it's clear to me that what Kim is doing now is to make a deal with South Korea, use this new agreement to build a very strong economy in the peninsula. And, this is the same country. If you think about it, it's been a country for 3,000 years. So, the North is very rich in resources. The South was the rice basket, but now the South also is technologically very, very advanced. So there are these interdependencies that can develop, which can be extremely beneficial for both countries. Cheap labor from the North, for example, a technology coming from the South. And I think what Kim is trying to do is to re-legitimize the existence of the regime based upon economic success.
Do you know of any goods, come to think of it, that may be exported from North Korea that other countries import? I don't know if the US imports any goods from North Korea, or maybe
No.
they do through the South, or there is a factory that's on the border that both North and South Koreans come to and work. I don't know what they produce. It's a very large factory. I'm just wondering, do they have any exports as such?
Well, I mean, they export, number one, they cannot export because, of course, the sanctions have been in place for a long time. I mean, there have been new rounds of sanctions, but North Korea has been under sanction for decades, one way or another. So they export minerals to China. China, 90% almost of their export goes to China, then from China to somewhere else. But it's mostly coal and minerals. They also have mines of rare earth minerals, which of course is very important for the electronic industry. There was they created a sort of special economic zone near the demilitarized zone where South Korean industrialists could produce their products using North Korean labor. But the product was made in South Korea. It was not. Although the special economic zones were in the north. Those zones were closed because of the sanctions again. So really, you have to look at the so-called illegal kind of trade to find important products. And these are, of course, weapons. They are a very big producer of weapons. The weapons are sold illegally because, breaking the ban due to the sanctions to countries like Sudan, for example. So it's a rogue state to rogue state kind of trade. They also produce methamphetamine, which they sell in Southeast Asia. And then there is the nuclear technology, the missiles, the long-range missiles. So these are more or less, the most important product that they export.
So with the development of nuclear weapons, they obviously have or are very specialized in technology, especially when they try to have this cyber warfare with other countries. I'm sure that's a lot of that goes on, and it is sourced in North Korea. I know there's been some cyber attacks that have been linked back to, say, Russia or China. I'm not sure there was any from North Korea, but if they have this skill set to develop certain technologies like long-range nuclear missiles or nukes, then do they not have an incentive to redirect that intelligence and, I suppose, have the economies of scale or economies of scope to build up certain industries and become specialized in certain tech? Or pharmaceuticals even, given your methamphetamines?
Yeah, I think so. They do have, for example, the long-range missiles that they have tested last year is all 100% North Korean design and technology. Now, of course, they got to that level, stealing information and technology from other countries or buying it. With the implosion of the Soviet Union, a lot of scientists relocated to North Korea because North Korea attracted them with very good salaries. But yes, they do have that kind of expertise that can be put to the use of an industry that is not a criminal industry or an illegal industry. They also have the resources in terms of natural resources. The North is rich in mines of various types. Of course, coal and anthracite coal, which is the best quality available. It's very important for China because the consumption and the production of coal in China is insufficient and the consumption is very high, although China is going green more and more. So I would say yes. I think potentially the reunification of North Korea, not in political terms, but in economic terms, could be extremely beneficial for both countries, to the extent that they could create a sort of union, something similar to the all common market, which will produce an economy much, much stronger than Japan, for example. And that would be a real big challenge in that part of the world. Because, the Korean peninsula is better equipped and better structured than Japan is today to become a big economy.
Episode 155 with Lotta Moberg on refugee cities and special economic zones. Lotta, your work has then brought you to another area that you're actually working with called refugee cities.
Yes.
And I just checked out the website, and I think it's amazing what you're working on here, refugeecities.org. And this is, again, using your experience on special economic zones and then looking at the refugee camps that we see. There just seem to be everywhere. Latin America, North America, Europe, North Africa, that these people who are not forced into camps, but find themselves in refugee camps, they do not have the dignity or the life that they would have had if everything was all back to normal in their own country that they've happened to flee from. So what was the whole idea regarding refugee cities and also bringing in the sustainable or the special economic zones that you work on?
Yeah, the idea that we had, we started working on this back in 2014, I think it was, maybe 13. It was very much how to implement special economic zones in new and effective ways. The big misconception of refugee camps is often that they are temporary, because that's what they are on paper. Temporary solutions, they last for a little while, and then people go back home or resettle. And alas, that is not the reality. These camps can last for decades and generations. The best example would be the Dadaab camp in kind of complex of camps in Kenya, and where you have third generation refugees. And they are often, in many countries, they're explicitly prohibited from working. You cannot pursue commercial activity, which is just off the charts ridiculous, you'd think. Often people are entrepreneurial, people have talents, they want to work. Of course, they want to have a better life. And as you say, like the dignity aspect of it, not just saying, hey, we're just going to be taking care of you. Often in refugee camps, you have the UNHCR being involved and providing like the bare necessities. But the idea is to think how refugees can actually find in the long run, both having a better life in the camp, but also in the long run, find their way out of there. What if they can actually accumulate capital? There's a political economy problem of people in their host countries not wanting to accept them because they see them as poor, they don't want them in there. We don't want to take care of you. Keep them in the camps. Well, what if they can show that, hey, this factory that is set up just outside the camp, that can, by the way, also hire local people from the host economy that is not refugees. What if then the refugees can show, hey, I work here, I accumulated this capital, I'll be fine resettling now in your country. Too bad I can't go back home. The conflict is still going on. And that could be, the way to go. That's very much the idea. I've been on the integrating a lot with on the academic side here, and like spreading the understanding and the interest of this. And I do have a paper coming out that the refugee special economic zone concept.
Okay.
So hoping more and more people are going to kind of pick up the idea and see where it goes. And
sorry, again, this is totally new for me because whatever was special economic zones, but I can only speak for myself, but I could never make a connection like the way you had done, say, we spoke about blockchain, but also now with refugee camps. And these camps are not just small camps. They are vast in terms of the sizes, the square area, where a lot of people, talented people, could offer human capital resources and drive the economy within that area and contribute to the overall economy of the host country. But linking the special economic zones with the refugee camps is an extremely clever idea to give them that particular status, to allow them to integrate into the economy as not only refugees but immigrants more so, that are able to offer their expertise or entrepreneurialism that they have. And they would have to drive. Somebody who is, I'm sure, at a low level in terms of their dignity and their status, I suppose you could call it, they want to prove themselves, and they would work extremely hard to do that. And this is something that a host country should entertain, not necessarily entertain, but should encourage and provide provide the outlet to do so through these zones.
Yeah,
have you spoken to the UN or anything about this, or have the UN done any work on trying to adopt and apply this type of special economic zone status to refugee camps?
Yeah, there are progress being made that I can't talk about, and I'm not the person who actually is doing a lot of that kind of integration and meeting and doing all the meetings and things like that. But there's certainly interest out there. There's certainly governments that have flagged their interest in being kind of part of it. And I would say that anyone who works in special economic zones, you have to be you cannot seek the best solution. It's the second best kind of solution that we're looking at, because one criticism is, for example, well, wouldn't it be better if? Wouldn't it be better if they can just resettle in the economy? Why are you encouraging that, that they can't go back and things like that? And it's like, you have to think marginal benefits. There's a reality out there that says that it's just not possible for them to either settle in their host country or go back home. And often, the entering the new country has to do with a political economy problems. There's political resistance to it. And as long as you have that, that's just a fact on the ground. And it's great for people who work on migration issues and advocating for the benefit of letting more people in. I'm definitely for that. I want to see more of that. And then I can kind of work on my end in the meantime, kind of finding the second best kind of solution.
So with this forthcoming paper you have on it, what was your objective of the paper, and what findings did you come across, or what insights did you gather from it?
Yeah,
are you allowed to say?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been published in the GEPP, will be the journal. It's very much a theoretical paper, and with all the arguments and all the logic laying out why these zones connected to refugee camps make sense, what the benefit should be, and then looking formally to kind of simple math, kind of looking at, well, it can benefit everyone, yes, because a lot of the criticisms will be nobody will want to go to the zone or to invest. Like, how are you going to attract investors? Or are you exploiting the people? Or will the government actually allow for this? And the answer is maybe not. Maybe there will be issues. Maybe there will be problems. Maybe in all places, it's certainly the case that there will be countries where you cannot find a location that is good enough for investors to come at the same time that the government can provide benefits that is on net a positive for the government, as opposed to just taking care of maintaining the refugees and giving them food. So there will be these trade-offs, but the pursuit is finding location that actually works, finding the conditions that are actually right. And if you can find one, and if you can help 1,000 people get a better life out of, the million refugees out there, that will be pretty cool, So it's a matter of having these experiments where you just say, we may fail, and let's try it, and let's try to do our best and see how far we can go.
Episode 167 with James Kenneth Galbraith on the prospects for the Greek economy. Your recent book, Welcome to the Poison Chalice, The Destruction of Greece and the Future of Europe. It's a very intriguing title. And in this, you reflect on what could be considered an avoidable economic catastrophe. And is that the case for Greece? Could it have been avoided?
Well, the phrase "welcome to the poison chalice" is actually something that the finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis, said to me the moment I arrived at his offices in Syntagma Square at the start of his 4 or 5 month tenure as the Minister of Finance in Greece. And it reflects the reality that we knew at the time, which is that we were under intense pressure. The Greek government was in intense pressure to conform, to buckle to the demands of its creditors, and that these demands had nothing to do with restoring the Greek economy or with helping the welfare of the Greek people, everything to do with the politics of satisfying first of all, rescuing the banks of France and Germany, and secondly, stabilizing and satisfying the creditor interests in those countries and other countries of Northern Europe. So we were looking at what was intrinsically very hostile and very unproductive from the Greek point of view to economic policy. Could it have been avoided? Yes. There should never have been the original devil's bargain of 2010 when Greece became essentially the pass-through entity for a vast loan from the taxpayers of Europe to the bankers of France and Germany. That was the essence of what happened, and the liability for the debt ended up largely on the backs of Greek taxpayers. So this was what we called extend and pretend. Make a new loan and pretend it's going to be paid when you know it is not going to be paid. That is a formula for perpetuating economic stagnation, and eventually, of course, the basic destruction of the social fabric of the country. The core social institutions, education, healthcare, transportation all get run down. It's very hard to run a business because your taxes are very high, your margins are very, very low, if you have any possibility of making a profit at all. And people who are younger and have any capacity to do so will go work elsewhere, will leave the country. And Greece is already suffering a substantial population migration, out-migration as a result of that. And once your productive younger people leave, and the situation becomes more and more untenable over time. So that's the situation facing Greece. Europe has, in fact, taken one of its member countries and made an example of it for political reasons in order to scare other countries and other voters in other countries. And to me, this is a form of, if you like, collective punishment. And I'm not saying that the Greek governments of the past, which were often in the hands of self-dealing and corrupt elites, are not responsible. They clearly are. But the function of a political union is to look out for the welfare of its members, not to teach moral lessons or to impose a particular politics that happens to serve one constituency at the expense of another. And that's clearly what we're seeing in Europe, unfortunately. I
remember the situation quite well, as if it was only the other day, and I was quite critical of what was going on. It was like as if Germany and France, they felt collectively that you couldn't have their banks collapsing or their economy collapsing because of the bad debts or, the bad debts from, say, Ireland or Greece or any of the other peripheral countries in Europe. So the penalties were...
You're breaking up a little bit, but let me just say, can you hear me?
I can hear you clearly.
Okay, good. Let me just say that the German and the French governments and the international agencies of that time, including the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, knew very well that their policy that they were imposing would not work to improve the Greek economy. The staff of the IMF and other executive directors of the IMF said so in May of 2010. They knew very well that they had the technical means to rescue their own banks, but they did not want to take political responsibility for that. So they cooked up this scheme in which loans were made to Greece and immediately used to repay the debts held by the banks, effectively transferring the debts from the banks to the taxpayers of Europe. And it then becomes very hard for any elected government, say Chancellor Merkel's government in Germany, to admit to those taxpayers that they are not going to get repaid. And especially hard for the governments of smaller countries, some of which were poorer than Greece, and Slovakia, for example, who became creditors of Greece, but to say, oh, well, you made the Greeks a loan, and guess what? We knew that they were not going to be able to repay it. So you end up in a position where, unlike an ordinary commercial debt rescheduling and renegotiation or bankruptcy, you have this political barrier to acknowledging that the thing was a catastrophic mistake or a catastrophically misconceived policy. And now the payment comes due because there are bigger countries. There is in particular one bigger country which can see very clearly what happened and isn't willing to go down to accept the same treatment, and that's Italy. And the confrontation that is now building between the Italian government, which is a government of so-called populists, mostly right-wing populists, but still, is quite determined, appears to be quite determined not to accept the same dictation of economic policy from Brussels at the expense of the people who elected it. And so we are going to see the escalation of tensions in Europe over this question. Italy is not a country you can push around. It's 20% of the Eurozone.
That's the thing. Like, I was surprised Italy got off the hook, if you want to say that, because of the large population that it has, and maybe the passion that the population would have that they could destabilize the area. I know the Greeks went on strikes, on a lot of strikes. Irish didn't, and I was again surprised that the IMF, I think it was the IMF, tried to suggest to Greece that they should sell off their ports and make them all privatized.
Well, the privatization of the port of Piraeus was to a Chinese firm. It was done, I think, in a quite constructive way that involved the kinds of things that you would want to see. An agreement on investment in modernizing the facilities, and an agreement on the treatment of the maintenance of workers' rights and so forth. But the privatization of the Greek regional airports was carried out in a way which was just to maximize the benefit to the creditors. They only sold the ones that were profitable. The ones that were not profitable were still left with the Greek state. And then you have pressure to privatize the power companies and the water company, everything practically that is private that can be sold. Even historic sites are on the list for privatization. And that is really quite indefensible from even a constitutional standpoint with respect to Greece. So you're looking at what is essentially asset stripping, asset seizures as a way of asserting the interests of the creditors in this matter. There were also I could go on, and the list is quite long, of ways in which the political interests of wealthy and powerful European forces were imposed on Greece under the pretext of so-called economic reforms, which had no reasonable relationship to the improvement of the Greek economy. People need to be very clear. The word reform is thrown around here, but it does not mean that it's something which is intended to benefit the entity which is being reformed.
We have to remember that Greece is a different type of economy. It's more of a tourist-dependent economy. And
it's true up to a point. Tourism is about 20% of the Greek economy, but there are also and have been industries. There was still, 3 or 4 years ago, a viable pharmaceutical industry, for example, in Greece. And there are others. Shipping is a major industry in Greece. Before Greece joined the European Union, it had a substantially larger industrial sector. There were, in fact, some automobiles that were made in Greece as well. But over the period of integration with the European economy, it has become largely deindustrialized and much more dependent on tourism. And tourism is an industry which has saturation limits. There's only so much you can do, even in a country that is as beautiful and extensive as Greece is. You can't make a kind of extended development out of tourism. So you need to think about what the Greek economy can do, as how it can be positioned in Europe as a center for other things as well. And that's what we were trying to do in 2015, to have a vision about how one can develop the cultural industries, could develop the educational industries, one could develop health and retirement in Greece as industries. But to do that, you need to have resources, and you need to have investors, and you need to have a clear prospect that you can make a living doing this over a long period of time. And so long as you're mired in an incurable debt crisis, nobody in their right mind is going to make those kinds of investments.
Episode 150, Chris Blattman, on the economic and psychological effects of violence and war, especially among children and also in communities.
I suppose the important part from the perspective of someone who's more of an applied statistician like me, is that it seemed that the people, like the exposure to violence, and in particular the act of conscription by the rebel group, looked pretty idiosyncratic, or at least, after you account for a few things like the child's age, or some aspects of the location, or maybe some aspects of the household, children who are abducted and children who are not, it was sort of a quasi-random act, or so was the argument. And if you take that, then you can actually follow. What we did is we followed kids 10 or 15 years after exposure to these acts, and we were able to say, so if we believe that this is sort of conditional on all these things, it's almost a random event of who's abducted and who's not, or who's exposed to this violence and who's not, then we can say, what is the long run impact of this exposure on your labor market performance, on how much education you obtain, on long run psychological trauma, symptoms of distress, and how does this affect your long-run social relationships and political behavior? So there was a lot of, because if you don't know the answer to that, then you probably are designing programs and policies and treatments in the wrong way. So an example is that if you think that everyone's traumatized by these terrible experiences, and these were really some of the most horrendous experiences one could imagine, then you want a system of really broad-based psychological treatment in the long run, and availability of counseling, which is a big ask in a place, many post-war places in Africa, many non-war-torn places in Africa have virtually no psychologists. And actually what we found is something that was, I don't think is shocking if you're a psychologist, but wasn't well established, which is that most people recover on their own fairly well. It's a relatively modest number of people who continue to experience very strong symptoms. I mean, it's a pretty terrible experience no matter what, but relatively few people experience debilitating symptoms of distress that really interfere with their ability to get married or get a job or go on in life. And so if that's the case, then now you need a very different approach. You need a hyper-targeted approach. You need a way to quickly diagnose who are these extreme cases and then deliver very targeted services. And so that's an example of how I think the research we did started to change the way people were trying to deliver some kind of relief and recovery after this war. And
how did those children get on afterwards? Did they pretty much fit into society like any other kid growing up, and did they do it just as well as anyone else, or were there extreme outliers from the rest of the population?
Well, it's important to remember, and not every war is like this, but that the whole society was so wholly and completely disrupted by war. And so nobody had a family nobody's family was immune from this conflict. So it's sort of like World War II or World War I in the West. Like, it was this all-consuming war, and every family, somebody fought or somebody died. And so it was this shared experience. And this is important because it might be very different when a very small percentage of the population is exposed to a trauma and comes back to a society that maybe where nobody understands. And so basically they get on in I guess maybe the big conclusion is that this was an economically devastating event for most families, and that is some ways it's paramount in most people's minds as to what they see as the problem, that they had a set of opportunities that were crushed because of this war that not only robbed them of their chance to earn a livelihood, but then if they had some terrible act of violence, or rebels looted their home, or rebels kidnapped them for a number of years, that ended their schooling, or that eliminated their entire asset stock, like their cows, or that destroyed their houses, or that led to the burning down of their fields. And so there's this enormous economic setback, and that almost consumed their attention, even at the moment when we were talking to them years afterwards, more than any of the psychological trauma, which is, of course, still important. And so, because they want to feed their kids, and they want to get on in life, and they want to have more than 1 or 2 meals a day, and they want their kids to be able to go to a school, and so forth. And so this was so they're getting on, but it was mostly an economic setback. And so in many ways, it looks like people who were, they're not that different from people who were exposed to some nonviolent disaster. And then the aspect of violence, I suppose one of the things that there are these, most people live with some very painful memories. Some people have sort of are debilitated by this. But what was interesting, and one of the unexpected things we found, and subsequently it's been found in dozens of other places affected by violence, is the people who are exposed to more violence are actually more politically and socially active later in life. So at least within their own group and society and villages, one fairly common thing, counterintuitive, somewhat surprising, but really widely documented now, is that exposure to traumatic experiences often leads people to become more socially oriented, more cooperative, more engaged in their communities. And so there are there is a silver lining to this dark cloud.
Episode 169 with Jennifer Murtazashvili on democracy and governance in Afghanistan and the leadership role of women in communities in Uzbekistan. Jennifer, have you asked people what they think of democracy, or when they heard the word democracy, what did they perceive it to be? Or what did they relate it to?
This is a really interesting question. So I actually did some research on this. I actually haven't published it, but I've got some interviews on this, and one of these days I'll get around to finishing this paper. But it's, when people talk about democracy in Afghanistan, it's not about politics. It tends to be on things related to popular culture and a different way of life. And so democracy means, the freedom for girls to dress differently, or Western music, or Western culture. It's very much associated. It's a concept that's very much associated with the West. And this is not just true of Afghanistan. I think it's true of a lot of other countries. I spent about a month this summer in Kyrgyzstan, and words like democracy have come to mean anything that's sort of supported by the West, and Western governments, in the U.S. in particular. Words like gender, words like civil society, they all have a very Western connotation, which also means that they're not indigenous. But that doesn't mean that these countries don't have things that, people don't believe in gender equality, or they don't believe in civil society. They have plenty of civil society. It's just that they don't use that term to describe it. Mm. And so it's very interesting to me. For example, when I was living here in Uzbekistan 15 years ago, people would talk about, we live in democracy now. And I'm thinking, democracy, this is one of the world's most authoritarian countries. But the word democracy at that time meant what wasn't the Soviet Union, maybe sort of a more market-oriented period. So the word democracy just meant something about relaxation of price controls, reduction of the role of the government in sort of welfare provision, but had much more to do with markets than it had to do with political institutions, because they had absolutely no democratic political institutions. But in Afghanistan, it very much has this connotation of not necessarily political representation, but of sort of Western culture, I would argue.
Do they relate it, or do they worry about losing traditions, cultures, and also maybe their religion?
I don't think so. I mean, I think there's some rhetoric of that, right? Because, and it's not unique to Afghanistan. I think you even see this in the United States, right? We have outsiders coming in and importing ideas, and this is going to be somehow a threat to our culture and identity. But you do see much more, I think, of an urban-rural divide, as you see in a lot of countries. But these sort of urban, educated, sort of Western-looking, ostensibly, although I would say that they're not all Western looking. I think a lot of Westerners sort of mistake, people who speak English and who have been products of their aid organizations as holding similar values about many issues is often mistaken. I think the situations tend to be much more nuanced than that. We tend to see these things as outsiders, especially in sort of black and white terms.
A number of people I interviewed on the podcast, such as Darren Asimoglu, they recommended or suggested that economic programs should include some form of political economy. And they lack that in a lot of universities and colleges. And what's your view on that? I know it could be somewhat biased given that's where you're coming from, but we miss out on it here when we're teaching economics. We don't necessarily go down the political economy route.
Mm-hmm. You mean that countries as part of reform should look at political economy? Yeah,
or even in all universities throughout, say, the Western world. I'm sure there are quite a few out there that teach political economy, but some of them lack it or don't have them in their modules when they're lecturing economics.
Absolutely. And in fact, I was just looking at the economics curriculum here because I'm talking to some colleagues actually about doing some university partnerships, because this country is, one of the things I haven't mentioned is that, why am I here in Uzbekistan? Because that dictator who was so cruel to so many, he passed away 2 years ago, and his successor has really opened things up, and the country's reforming at a really rapid pace. And so it's quite exhilarating actually to be back and seeing many old friends and meeting with government officials who really want to push things forward. And one of the things they're very interested in is education and higher ed and partnering with universities, and especially American or Western universities. And so one of the things we talked about is, doing political economy, public policy, economics education that really looks at incentives and sort of political economy issues rather than just, here it's still very Soviet notions of economics is what's taught. They really have not made the transition from that many countries made 25 years ago, because the political reform was really stalled over the past 25 years. So yeah, I mean, I would totally agree with that these, universities need more of it. And there's actually few people here doing political economy research.
So the revolution that happened back in 2005 wasn't successful at all. And it's only from the passing.
It wasn't a revolution. I'd probably get in trouble if someone heard me say that here. But it was just a very localized uprising that never spread.
Okay. So I think that kind of happened in Turkey as well.
Yeah. So it was just in this city called Andijan. But it never spread to other cities, and the government really cracked down on civil society and anything that was, that involved Western, democracy promotion, civil society, NGOs, anything that came from the outside that was promoting those kinds of things. That's why I was unable to return, and Western academics doing public opinion surveys or kind of ethnographic work even, was unable to do research here.
You probably read Jenny Norberg's book, did you? On The Underground Girls of Kabul, In Search of a Hidden Resistance in Afghanistan.
I haven't read it.
No, I was just wondering, because you mentioned earlier on about gender differences in Afghanistan. Is that still there, or even in Uzbekistan? I know they're different countries, but you said they have similar norms and traditions. Is that the case for girls in Uzbekistan as it is in Afghanistan?
The situation, I mean, it's a really interesting sort of example of, something that Asimoglu and Robinson would talk about, looking at these borders between these two countries. If you look at the Uzbek population that lives in Afghanistan versus the Uzbek population that lives in Uzbekistan, you find stark differences. And this really has to do with the Soviet the very sort of coercive role that the Soviets had in promoting gender equality in former Soviet spaces. So, in the 1920s, the Soviets, famously made women burn their burqas and take them off, and the hijabs were banned, and women were really sort of forced into more Western clothing and Western appearances. You couldn't wear any kind of headscarf in public places, but in Afghanistan you found something very different, and the government never really tried to get involved in this. Although there was a king in the King Amanullah who ruled from 1918 to the late 1920s, and he tried to eliminate traditional clothing and ban the burqa and promote gender equality and get rid of the bride price. And he was famously run out of the country for this because it was seen as sort of a reform from above rather than something coming from below. But you still have, major issues with gender equality inside of Afghanistan. But what you do see are norms that are changing. And I think that's how we have to think about things, that rather than aid programs promoting gender equality, individuals change. We can't think of these societies, and I think we tend to think of them as quite static. But they're dynamic and they're changing, and social norms change, and globalization affects countries, and education affects countries, and so is the role of women the same in Afghanistan as it was 50 years ago? I would argue that it's not. You see more women educated. You see more women participating in public life. In fact, this afternoon I was talking to an Uzbek civil society, a human rights advocate, and she said, our situation here in Uzbekistan is actually quite shameful. We used to have so many more women active in politics and in the public sector. In the past, 15 years, we've seen a major reduction in that. She says, and we have women who are very well educated. There's compulsory education. You have 99% literacy rates. I mean, you have a very well educated population. You go to Afghanistan, she says it's kind of a shame for us because in Afghanistan you actually have many more women as serving as governors and as ministers and in parliament than we actually have here. And I hadn't thought about it that way, but she was actually right.
I'm sure a lot of questions are floating around in your mind as you are introduced to new people, or you have conversations with people regarding social norms or traditions or maybe inequalities that do exist in these countries. And what are the more kind of immersive questions that you'd like to tackle? That you haven't done so already.
Yeah, there's so many of them. One of the things I'm looking at here in Uzbekistan is I'm looking at all the reforms that are taking place, and I'm looking at, why the government's reforming in certain sectors rather than others. This is sort of a more macro level question. Really interested in it because it's happened so quickly and so unexpectedly. Nobody expected these reforms to be taking place here. We've been talking about, so many commentators are talking about how democracy is going downhill all over the world, and this is one place it's not quite democratized, but it's certainly opened up in many, many spheres from where it was just 2 years ago. I'm interested in communities and community governance and, the ability of community leaders to maintain social control and the legitimacy that they have, because unlike Afghanistan, where you really have real self-governance, these customary forms of authority in this country, in Uzbekistan, were co-opted by the state and formalized by it. And I'm really interested in what effect that formalization had on legitimacy. And I hear mixed things from, field work that I do. And I'm then comparing that to Tajikistan, where I've also spent some time, where the government's co-opted these customary organizations, but doesn't quite have the capacity, at least the coercive capacity that the government in Uzbekistan does. And so you see sort of an intermediate outcome in Tajikistan, where the government has sort of laid off these customary authorities, but given them some capacity to do things. And there you have, it's really interesting. You've got mass migration to Russia, mass labor migration.
Okay.
And I was doing some public opinion surveys in rural Tajikistan, and It was funny. The survey firm asked me, they said, do you want a 50-50 men and women sample? I said, well, of course, when we're doing surveys, we want like a 50-50 sample because we assume the population sort of normally distributed 50-50 men and women. Mm. And they said, well, that's going to cost you extra. I said, why? They said, because of migration, we're going to have to oversample men. I said, no, I just want a representative sample. I get the survey results back. Can you believe it? 70% women in the summertime.
Wow.
So only 30% of the population were men, which means that these women are ruling communities. So I actually have some survey data that I'm going through right now and looking at.
But yet they're underrepresented in government and that.
They're underrepresented in formal government. But what I'm finding is that at the customary level, they're actually taking over. And so I can tell whether a community was led by a man or by a woman. And so now I'm doing I actually don't have my results back quite yet, but looking at the effects of whether a governance outcomes of when a community is run by a woman versus run by a man.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. Under such, and it's a fairly, what we call a conservative society where women have not had a huge role in the public sector, but all of a sudden, because of this migration, they have become leaders of their communities.
Episode 145 with Marie Mora on underrepresented minority women in economics and the plight of Puerto Ricans in the United States.
In fact, this actually came out of another Twitter conversation last year through one of our members in the mentoring program raised the question that why don't we have, program, we never talk about underrepresented women, underrepresented minority women in economics. And so this started a conversation with the chair of the Committee on the Status of Women, myself and a couple of other people in the mentoring program. And so as a result, at the AA annual meetings, we put together a session on best practices for mentoring underrepresented minority women. And so, again, the numbers are so small. If you just lose one or two, you're talking about a significant difference. And so we hope with having more voices and true diversity in the economics profession, that these individuals will serve as role models and inspire future leaders in the econ profession. In addition, one of my big concerns is that a lot of policies are being designed that affect minority communities and communities of color, and also impoverished communities, that they're being designed without the input from people who are actually from those communities. So as economists, we believe in perfect information, and information is what makes, market systems work. But without perfect information, then we have policies being designed that are incomplete. And so we want not just diversity in terms of what people look like, what their race, ethnicity, gender are. We really want diversity of thought, diversity of experience, diversity of ideas.
Yeah, and I think that's important, especially if it's, and I don't know if it's a racial issue or is it just solely a cultural issue, and maybe the minorities who are represented by these programs or are involved in these programs, they are American, they have immigrated to America or migrated to America too, and I'm sure whatever their status is, they're still in the educational system. So having that diversity that you refer to is very important to make policy changes. And I've noticed there of late you were recently appointed to the board of directors of the Dallas Fed's San Antonio branch to look at your research and to analyze regional economic conditions in Texas. And I'm just wondering how you would bring those two together and what you would do in your role on the board of directors to facilitate this type of research and also to implement the policies, economic policies, to represent. And that's a big thing, is to represent these people and make those policy changes. Not only are you representing them, but you have to perhaps within that board justify your research and push it through as well.
Yes, that's a very good question, and thank you for bringing that up. I was very excited to be appointed to the board of directors for the Dallas Fed San Antonio branch. One of the things that they want us to do as directors, they call it collect economic intelligence, and so we meet. It's about maybe 6 to 8 times a year, and we basically talk about some of the experiences that we're getting. So they want anecdotal evidence. They want, again, like what they call economic intelligence, to talk about what's actually happening on the ground. And the boards of directors can potentially serve as a rich source of information for the Federal Reserve System, particularly as decisions get filtered upward. And so part of my role as a director is I submitted a very short report, all of us do, before we actually meet. And so we have some conversations about what might be actually happening in our local area and the people that we are representing. When I was first asked if I would be interested in being on this board, one of the things they mentioned, they were interested in my input was specifically because a lot of my research has been on Hispanic economic outcomes. And also I've done a lot of work in terms of raising the issue of trying to diversify the economics profession. And those are two areas that the Fed apparently is valuing and wants to get more input.
I had a brief look at your university, your university's website, the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley. And to be honest, it reads like a retreat.
Okay.
It reads like a great destination for a tourist, and I'm sure students and staff have fantastic amenities. I know I'm digressing from our conversation for the moment, but it reads very well, and it reads as if you're in a lovely location.
Right. It's actually it's a wonderful place. It's a very different area for the United States. So as you know, the U.S. is very broad, covers a wide geographic area. So we are located down in the very southern tip of Texas. So we're about an hour and 15 minutes from the Gulf of Mexico. So South Padre Island is really close. And our campus is spread over 70 miles. And so our Brownsville campus is actually quite a bit closer to South Padre Island. They call this part of Texas the Texas tropics. There are lots of palm trees. It has snowed twice in the last 100 years, so we don't have cold winter. We have brutal summers. We make up for it in the wintertime, but it's mild enough year round that you have flowers blooming, and so it's a very nice place to be. In terms of the demographics, the students represent about 90% of the students are Hispanic, and that represents a general area. So we draw heavily from our local communities for our institution. And so it's one of the highest percentages in the nation. And then we are the second largest producer of Hispanics in higher education. The largest one is Florida International University in Florida.
And that's interesting that you also have a higher representation in Florida too, because one of your books that you wrote, Population Migration and Socioeconomic Outcomes of Island and Mainland Puerto Ricans, I'm going to mess this up, La Crisis Boricua?
Boricua.
I think within that, you made an analysis or comparison between Puerto Ricans represented in New York and those in Florida. And there's an approximate similar population of about 1.1 million in each. And you analyzed the outcomes, the socioeconomic outcomes, and identified whether they were similar or quite different. And I'm just wondering, I'd love to find out a bit about that, because, I know it's different to Texas and Florida regarding the university, and maybe going back to that later on, I'd like to find out how many, if you have the statistics, how many go on to do further education, unless you want to address that one first.
Okay. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. We have a lot of anecdotal evidence about the students we send off, but I don't have the numbers. I would think our university does keep track of our graduates who go on to get their graduate degrees elsewhere. For economics, by the way, we don't have a PhD program in econ. So when we have students interested, we try to, through networks, try to place our students in other programs where we know that they'll feel welcome.
To probably move on to the University of AUM or ANU, is it?
Yeah, Texas A&M is one of those institutions. And in fact, for disclosure, that's where I received my PhD.
Yes, that's right.
But they've actually been very proactive with hosting annual conferences for faculty across the state of Texas. Okay. And the conferences have the theme of economic issues affecting Hispanic communities. They pay for all the travel for the faculty, but our price of admission is we need to bring a student who's interested in pursuing a graduate degree in economics. And that way the students also get exposed to an academic conference where they can see how wide-ranging economics is. Mm-hmm. So econ is quite varied. We can answer a lot of very interesting questions with it. So I always tell my students that there's something in economics for everybody, regardless of what your tastes are, because it is such a broad a very broad field.
And I only recently discovered that, when I say recently, with this economics podcast, how broad and diverse it is in terms of what you could do. And people I spoke to have PhDs in economics, but there's stuff in there I just didn't even think you could do it on economics.
Right. Yeah, so it's a really neat discipline, or it can be. It's potentially a very exciting discipline, given how wide ranging it is. And so again, there's something in it for everybody. It's just, if we can find that, and if we, again, going back to networking, if we can find people that have similar interests, and even topics like you mentioned that you may not realize that you can analyze with a lot of our economic tools, and trying to view things through the lens of an economist.
That's true. So your book regarding the migration, population, and socioeconomic conditions of Puerto Ricans, within that, there were two cohorts, I suppose, one in New York and one in Florida, of about 1.1 million each. Did you develop an analysis on the conditions of the Puerto Ricans within those two states and how they evolved over time?
Yes, and so thank you for bringing up the book. So our book came out in this past November 2017. We got the galley proofs for our book 2 days after Hurricane Maria struck Puerto Rico. And so one good thing is that we hadn't finalized the publication, so we were able to put in an addendum. We begged the publisher to please give us more space, because normally they only want you to correct typos. We felt that a little bit of history behind the book. It actually started as a book chapter 5 years ago.
Okay.
It was for my two colleagues, Alberto Davila, who's at Southeast Missouri State University, and then Avidan Rodriguez, who was at the University of Albany, SUNY. We started working on a book chapter for someone else's volume, and it was going to be on Puerto Rican experiences in the United States. We just found that the more we were digging into the data, that there was a very interesting story going on that nobody was talking about. And that was, we were picking up large waves of migrants coming from Puerto Rico to the U.S. mainland. And we weren't quite sure what was driving that. We knew that Puerto Rico was undergoing an economic recession. We didn't realize when we first started how severe that recession was. Essentially, Puerto Rico's recession, and that's what we kept talking about the economic crisis. And that's where the title, we have the La Crisis Boricua as part of our title of the book, because it seemed like it's more than just a crisis or recession. It was something, basically it's Puerto Rico's depression. The island has been facing that since 2006. And so we're now well over a decade, and this is before Hurricane Maria struck. What we thought was extremely interesting is that using some of our data, that we realized that migrants going to different parts of the United States were not all the same. And so we seem to be picking up either migration patterns, or again, going back to networks, that migrants moving to Florida were different in terms of their socioeconomic characteristics than those moving to the traditional areas like New York. So New York is very famous for being a very old Puerto Rican community on the U.S. mainland. What we thought was interesting is that over the past decade, Florida's actually received a full 1/3 of all the migrants coming from the island of Puerto Rico, to the point that you have essentially the same number of Puerto Ricans in Florida as you do in New York. As you mentioned, it's 1.1 million. Those going to Florida tend to be higher educated than those going to New York. They have higher labor force participation rates. In our book, we talk a lot about Florida and New York. We try to, the best we can, compare also people who did not migrate, so those who remained in Puerto Rico. And then we look at other states as well. So it turns out Texas was one of the largest receiving areas of Puerto Ricans during this time. And that surprises a lot of people, because traditionally there have been very few Puerto Ricans in the state. It's not that there weren't Puerto Rican communities, it's just that they were relatively small in terms of the presence of Puerto Ricans across the country. At this point, there are more Cubans who live in the state of Florida than those of Puerto Rican descent. But if you take out Miami, so like the non-Miami state of Florida, there are more Puerto Ricans than you have even of Cubans. And so a lot of our book, we talk about the differences and how our main time frame analysis is from 2006 up to 2014, 2015, depending on when we wrote the chapters and how recent the data we have. But we were trying to track what was happening in terms of the new migrants and how they were settling in. And another comparison group is also how did Puerto Ricans, like the new migrants in Florida, compared to people who were born on the U.S. mainland. And so it was a very interesting book to be working on. And as I said, it started as a chapter and it just kept evolving. And we have manuscripts. We probably have enough material for several books. We had to pick and choose in terms of what ended up making it into the book.
Episode 161 with Tyler Cowen on art, culture, liberty and the prospects of economic growth and welfare in the United States, China and India. I only discovered the word a mate, and I'm assuming that's what you have on some of those pictures, have you? Mexican amates, or is that how you pronounce it?
Amate is the word. The ones right behind me are Russian avant-garde paintings from the teens and 20s, like by Leon Bakst. But in the home, there were maybe 400 or 500 works of Amate art on bark paper from central Mexico. And my home is the leading repository or collection of that work in the world.
You're kidding me.
Mostly bought from the painters themselves, in many cases commissioned. I wrote a book on them. I've been to their villages maybe 25 times. I've stayed there for extended periods of time.
And is it because you're holidaying there and that you fell in love with this type of work, the amates, or is it something that is culturally significant to you?
Well, it's both. I mean, holidaying is a funny word to use. You go to a village of around 1,500 people. There's no shower. There are no shops, no restaurants. There are barely toilets, which, by the way, don't flush. And at 4 a.m., the rooster crows, and you're up in the morning whether you like it or not. And the bed is quite hard, and there's no air conditioning. So inside the room, it can reach like 115 degrees at night. I enjoy it, but it's not what you would call a normal holiday.
Because the only other economist that I'm aware of who's collected a significant amount of paintings will be John Maynard Keynes. And I don't think many people know about that either, that in the 1920s he's accumulated a lot of artwork or art pieces.
That's right. You know, Spencer McCallum, not an economist, but he wrote on economics. He has a fantastic collection of Mexican pottery. Bill Baumel was himself a wood sculptor, was supposed to be quite talented. So there are a few of us with a foot in this other camp, but it is quite rare.
Okay, yeah, it very much is. And even though from an economics perspective, you know, you tend to price and value things. I've had a recent conversation with Arjo Klammer. I'm not sure if you're aware of Arjo.
Sure, I know him, yes.
Yeah, great. And one of the questions, we talked about art and culture. And one of the questions I asked Arjo was about the origins of culture, because the nature of the conversation we were having. And I found, based on your back catalogue, you wrote extensively on the praise of commercial culture, a book in 2000, and another one, Creative Destruction, how globalization is changing the world's cultures. And just, if you don't mind, if I ask you that question as well, the origins of culture, is there something there that we could point our finger on, or does culture change all the time?
Well, culture changes all the time, but I looked at a large literature, often in the humanities, on culture, and I found it was often lacking in rigor or didn't have enough economic insights. So I spent around 20 years of my career trying to combine my knowledge of economics with my experience in the cultural world. And I wrote really like 5-6 books tying together how economics and culture fit together. What are the preconditions for creativity? What can government do to encourage or discourage this? There's a funny story about R.U. Klammer, since you mentioned him.
Yeah.
You know, he first got an offer from George Mason University, and he turned it down. And then they offered the slot to me. So I'm very, very grateful to R.U. Klammer for turning down that job.
No way. That is amazing to hear.
He ended up in the Netherlands. I believe he's very happy there, and I'm very happy at George Mason.
He seems very happy.
Yes.
He's doing great
and now
work.
He's very involved in local government. He's like a provincial councillor or something.
Yeah, something like that. And he said by accident he found his way into art and culture because he was asked to do something on that type of work in his university, and he ended up just loving it, you know, the connections there with the artists and how we could arrange the values and around the art pieces, and it's not more about pricing the way economists might assume it to be.
I found it very useful to try to be a patron of the arts. You learn a lot about how the market works when you're in it. You also learn how things are from the point of view of a patron. So academic life is to some extent dependent on patrons, and the best way to understand the dilemmas of being a patron is to try to be one yourself. So I view that work I've done in the Mexican arts as absolutely one of my most formative experiences.
Your latest book, you've delved into numerous parts of the discipline in economics, even regarding politics as well. But your latest book that you have released, and it's now available on Amazon, is called Stubborn Attachments. And if you don't mind me segueing into that aspect of the conversation quite early, I think, even though we talked about culture, but in this book, it's the subtext is a vision for a society of free, prosperous, and responsible individuals. And I'd love to know the pretext to all of this, and the reason why you decided to call it Stubborn Attachments.
This is a book I've been working on for 20 years. You can think of it as an account of my stubborn attachments, which are to the ideas of economic growth and liberty and human rights and also sustainability. So if you go back and you look at what, say, Hayek, Mises, Rothbard, John Rawls, Robert Nozick wrote, they're all John Stuart Mill, they're all trying to justify their vision of a free society. And in my opinion, actually, all of those attempts failed. So I'm trying to reconstruct the case for freedom and economic growth, and also economics as a way of approaching human phenomena using philosophical argument. So in a way, it's my most personal book. It's my most direct book. It's the kind of final bottom line analysis. Here's what Tyler really thinks. And for 20 years, I would spend maybe a month a year working on the book, maybe 2 months a year, always returning to it, trying to improve it, changing my mind on things. And this is the final result of that.
The title Stubborn Attachments, is that like people have a preconceived idea of how the economy works in terms of the approach to the growth, or, you know, the future that we have ahead of us? You know, if they have that preconception and they're stuck to one type of thinking, philosophical thinking, should we be breaking away from that? Or are you saying that we should break down the barriers of all of those people who have come before us and embrace what is expected of us as a society in terms of welfare and that, and anything that's anything that comes our way, we should move away from our initial preconceived ideas and embrace the new thinking?
I'm saying people should have a stubborn attachment to at least two particular ideas. One is economic growth, which compounded over time will outweigh all other considerations in a utilitarian calculus. And the other is the idea that there are absolute human rights. To those two things, we should be stubbornly attached. That's what the title of the book is indicating. And other values in your calculus, they're going to be less important than those two. That's what much of the book tries to argue.
And that's really the underlying feature of human society, is being a free person. And we see a lot of injustice, I suppose, regarding people's welfare around us today, and their restrictions to growth could be affecting long-term growth for the whole economy, not only for the individual.
That's right. And you can think of human rights as a kind of negative freedom, like freedom from violent coercion from others. But then economic growth is positive freedom, more money to spend, more trips you can take, more things from culture you can explore, greater ability, to help out your children or choose the profession you want. So it's these two sides of freedom, positive and negative freedom. I'm trying to show they can be brought together in one consistent picture.
And what were the main questions that you have asked yourself at the beginning? You know, you said you took this as the 20 years in the making, and things have changed a lot over those 20 years that you have observed. And some of the questions that you might have asked earlier on, are they still valid questions? I know 20 years is only the equivalent of a droplet in the ocean, given our existence on Earth today and into the future. But the underlying questions, have they changed much? Have you identified positive and negative changes to growth over that time period?
I think a lot has changed over the 20 years. We've seen much more evidence that sustained growth is possible for the world as a whole. My own country, the United States, in some ways actually has disappointed me. But the notion that growth can elevate humanity as a whole, if you look at, say, China, India, they've done so well over the last 20 years. It's made me think the message of the book is more relevant rather than less. But again, I would gladly admit my own country is a kind of slacker in this regard. We haven't grown that much. We've done some very stupid things. We appear to be growing more complacent. we need to pick up the pace, we Americans.
Does it come to a point where it plateaus? Because the American economy would have grown quite significantly and China and India are at a lower base, so they're going to experience that exponential growth initially, and eventually, perhaps due to technological progress slowing down or catching up to that technological progress, that their economy actually, the rate of growth actually slows down to the level of, say, the American economy. So is that an acceptable argument? Or do you think there's more to it, that the American economy should grow? Or are you talking about welfare growth, not only economic growth?
Well, it's very likely, as you say, these other countries will slow down. But part of what economic growth does is move them from a position of extreme poverty to having lives as good as those in Western Europe or the United States. And that's a major, major achievement in terms of many kinds of human freedom. I think it's also true once you have China and India being wealthier, and you're seeing this already, they will innovate more so the whole world can grow at a higher rate, because we'll be getting new things from China, India, other countries, basically for free. Just to say the United Kingdom or Ireland, they get many innovations from Silicon Valley. They don't have to spend the R&D money themselves necessarily. There's a mutual benefit from having more countries on the innovation frontier, and that's what we're getting to.
Episode 160 with Aryo Klammer on culture in Japan and writing as a means to create personal value.
Japanese culture fascinates me, especially for these kind of contrasts, and it shows the big role that culture plays. I think that economies ultimately are embedded in culture, so even interaction in stores are influenced by it. If you go to a Japanese store, the people working there have to bow before they enter, because they pay their respect to the customer. If you walk around there in the metro, I actually by chance did that experiment without being aware of it, but try just to drop a piece of paper. You won't be able to, you don't succeed unless there's no one around. But there will be two Japanese pointing at you, telling you that you lost something, and two others will busy be picking it up. It's simply very hard to drop something, and therefore you see these metros are very clean. But you see it also in their food culture. They spend a lot of money on their food because they see food as medicine. So they care very much about the quality of the food. Very few people are fat, because that's also something that we won't appreciate, but an incredible social control. And so this society functions very different from ours. And then you become aware of the culture factor. I lived a long time in the United States, and I'm sure that you in Ireland also find out, if you go to another country, you discover how Irish you are, as I discovered, that I discovered how Dutch I was by going to Japan and the United States. And that is, I just finished a whole article about it, the interaction between culture and economy. This is very powerful. Only causations are, and I looked at all the research basically that has been done on it. It's very hard to establish causation because it is complex. And that's the other thing is, what some economists then try to make it into is an instrument for policy, but that's difficult because culture doesn't have knobs you can turn on, so to make people more aware or less aware. That's not how it works. So for an instrumentalist approach, it is not all that helpful, but it is very helpful to understand why people behave in a certain way, and where certain actions in that setting are simply not going to work because of the cultural context. So whether you run a company or you run a society or you run your own life, you have to take culture into account.
I just wonder, it's something I would be very interested in, to look at the cultural aspects of economics, or how to explore the economy with culture being the underlying reason to where we are at the moment in terms of our economy. I suppose it's something that I touched on in a recent podcast episode, that where does our economy begin? Does it begin with, the supply and demand of a product, or does it go way beyond that in terms of the resources that the earth give us? And I think you mentioned at the beginning, was it iPencil, or did you mention? Yeah, at the beginning. So, when you look at that story about how the pencil is made, or so where does all that begin, and how do you value this particular culture? And this is a book that you've written, actually, The Value of Culture, and you have a nice cover to it, the painting of Dr. Gachet by Vincent van Gogh. And when I was in America, I mentioned Van Gogh, and they said no, they didn't understand. They said it's Van Gogh. Now, given that you're Dutch, is it Van Gogh or Van Gogh?
In Dutch, it is Van Gogh.
Okay.
Van Gogh you cannot say, because that's sort of this guttural sounds is sort of typical Dutch, but that's the Dutch pronunciation.
Okay. So
but you're quite right. I mean, I still like the title of the book, The Value of Culture, because culture has a value and has also a price. But certainly has a value. But to come back to your point, how did it all start? See, when you define economics as scarcity and choice, and economists always go back to Robinson Crusoe, but it's kind of strange because Robinson Crusoe ends up on this island and leaves money behind because it has no use for him. He takes the tools because he needs the tools, and the money is worthless to him. And and indeed he has to make choices, right? To grow wheat for later use and so on, and to build a shelter that will give him coverage for some time to come. But what is also a big part of that story is that he also seeks company, and he sees his chance when he sort of saves Friday from being the main dish on in the meal. And what then, so it turns out that he is really sort of trying to develop companionship. That's a shared good, as I mentioned. But what also is never mentioned by economists is that he is trying to actually has an issue with his father and is an issue with his faith. He actually took 3 Bibles with him to the island, and he's seeking his father and he's seeking God. That's really what this is all about. So I say, taking this as an example, that economics is not so much about solving a problem of scarcity, but it is realizing values, trying to sort of valorize what's important to you. Like in his case, companionship, of course, survival too, but that he needed to do in order to do the things that are important, finding his father, finding God. And that's apparently was important for Robinson Crusoe. And if you interpret that story in that way, you get a different story than what economists make of it.
And there is a meaning, there's a metaphor to that story. I can actually, when you're telling me that the synopsis of it there, I can see that this is something that could represent somebody experiencing like an existential crisis in their life.
Yeah.
That they come to a point where they've like, you often hear young people saying, oh, I can't wait to earn money. I want to buy this, want to buy that. But then it gets to the point, if you fast forward maybe 15, 20 years later, that doesn't really matter anymore. You think, well, what value do I have? Going back to what you were talking about earlier on, what value can I bring? For example, there personally, about 2 years ago, I was thinking what I missed out on for the last 25 years was I missed painting and drawing. I was okay. I was good. And I was a good artist. And I had won a couple of competitions and national competitions here in Ireland. But as part of the schooling here, I was given a choice, because it was a relatively small school, I was given a choice between French and art. And I was told that you need French for college and whatever. So I decided, right, I'll do French, I'll drop art. And it was the last time I painted. And
really?
Yeah, definitely. And 2 years ago, I decided to pick up the pencil. And the first drawing I did was of Virginia Woolf.
Oh, really?
And it was just it was a pencil drawing. And I don't know why I chose Virginia Woolf. I think I took a side profile picture from my phone and I drew from that. And I just realized how meditative that was and how it was more me rather than the academic side of things. That I like that little bit of escapism and that bit of time. And I can value what artists have said about, what the meaning of their work, that even though I didn't do this for a price and I wasn't looking for a price, but I can understand where artists are coming from. And would you consider yourself an artist in terms of your writing and your books and how you value that, and what are you putting out there was not more of a monetary incentive, but more about getting exposure of this subject and this subject matter to other people?
Yeah, I really like writing, and I recognize your story by the way too about drawing. I just happened to see this movie by Salinger, famous for The Catcher in the Rye.
Okay.
And the movie is called Rebbe in the Rye. And what is intriguing, I try to tell it shortly because it sort of illustrates this. The guy wanted to write stories. And he had to overcome a lot of resistance and prove that he was a writer. And finally sort of produced Catcher in the Rye that most publishers didn't think is worth publishing. But Little Brown decided to go ahead with it, and it became a big success. And this is the interesting point. After success, he was actually also had a Buddhist teacher who sort of taught him to meditate on what is really important to him. And then he decided, and this is intriguing, what is important to me is writing. But what is not important for me is publishing, being read. So after getting Salinger, Catcher in the Rye published, he continued writing, but he never published anything anymore.
Okay.
And that's sort of, and most people hearing you said that doesn't make sense, but for him that made perfect sense, because what he really was, like you drawing this picture of Virginia Woolf, that gives you satisfaction for yourself. And you said it's meditative. And that's, if you talk with real craftspeople, and it can be a carpenter or a painter or a roof worker or a dentist, or a teacher, they always say they do it for the pleasure of doing it, and they get satisfaction of doing it well, and all the rest is secondary. So including appreciation you get, the money you get paid for it, that's secondary. At least that's what real craftsperson people will tell you. And then you find, and that is that lots of people engage in activities in their free time, playing soccer, playing the guitar, writing novels. In the Netherlands, there are apparently 2 million people writing novels in their free time. Chance of being published or recognized is zilch, but they will still do it simply because they enjoy doing it and they enjoy developing their skills. And that is sort of what I call these practices that people engage in that are meaningful in and of themselves. Mm. And I think if you want to have a complete picture of the economy, all that should be part of it, because it adds also it sort of has also consequences of what we consider to be richness and poverty. And typical for economists, we think that richness, and most people think that too, that richness is a matter of having a lot of money and poverty having little money or no money. But that doesn't make sense if you think broader, because if you have the skill of drawing, that is part of your richness. If you have the skill of being able to have insight about the economy, that's also part of your richness. Economists could call that still human or cultural capital. But having a nice family is part of your richness. And what we discover, that poverty is not necessarily always a consequence of having little money. Little money is usually the consequence of lacking shared goods, like families, like a nice neighborhood, like good friends. So the causation is the other way around. At least if you start looking through the lenses that I propagate here.
And finally, episode 153 with Sarah Squire and Steve Horvitz on their approach to writing. So your desk is a mess, is it?
Yes, it is. It always is.
But
and of course,
you know where everything is.
Well,
no,
I wouldn't go that far. And I'm always pulling.
It's making me a little shaky just sitting here, frankly.
So how different are you, Steve, to Sarah's process?
My desk is immaculate usually. I mean, like there's actual space to work on it, even if I'm in the middle of a project. And yeah, no, this is one of the major differences between us. I have a rage for order. I can't work if there's a mess. I need things all in place, both like professionally and personally. So, Dr. Squire is much more organic.
I'm Hayekian, really, about the organization of my office, which is order eventually emerges.
Yeah.
It's certainly not top down in any sort of way.
So you might be more the creative person then, and let it kind of grow organically in terms of the approach to your work or something, and maybe Steve, I don't know, are you more institutionalized?
We were actually talking about this just the other day, because we're both working on writing projects right now, and we're both in the early stages where you're really formulating your first thoughts about really narrowing down exactly what you're writing about and starting to outline a little bit.
Yeah.
And I was saying that his process is so much more orderly than mine is, and I think part of that is a disciplinary difference, which is that Steve, I think, and a lot of economists go back to some very set texts that they're always going to use. And this is in no way a criticism. There are just, if you're going to do sort of an Austrian approach to money and banking, right, there are things that you absolutely must use. He knows them really well. He's been using them for 30 years or more, right? Whereas for a paper like the one that I'm doing now, I'm using Shakespeare, right? But I'm also using, because it's gotten me into questions of theology and Elizabethan politics. So I'm looking at the Book of Homilies, and I'm looking at Calvin's biblical commentaries, and I'm looking at literary criticism on Richard III, and I'm sort of drawing from all over the place.
Okay.
So rather than sort of knowing where I'm going to look when I set out my question, I set out my question, and then I think, where might there be some stuff on that?
So it's like a discovery process.
Yeah.
Spontaneous order. Well, kind of.
From all over the place and finding things I don't expect.
Right.
Which is not to say that economists don't do that. I just think it's more endemic to particularly the kind of interdisciplinary literary work that I tend to do.
What's great about that is possibly it might lead you down a certain path where you may not have felt that you were going to go down, and you discover certain things that kind of blows your mind and think, I could use that really, or I could do something else with that later on by developing it even further. Whereas
I think one of the differences is that I tend to more often, I won't even start writing, like working on a project until like it's in my head and I have it. Right. And so I'm Mozart, right? When he says, is the opera done? And he says, it's just scribbling and bibbling, right? I mean, it's in my head. I have to write it. Now, that's not to say when I'll often sit down and start writing and realize as I'm writing, nope, it's a different thing than I thought it was, right? That discovery process happens too, where you realize, no, the thing I thought was the third part of this paper is really the thing that should be the first part of it, right? I mean, we all get that. I think, again, Sarah can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think like this project she's working on is much more one where she had a topic she wanted to explore and didn't quite know exactly what was going to happen with it. But in reading all this stuff, as she's, order emerges out of that into something coherent, right? And I think that's just some of that's disciplinary, but some of it is also sort of personal. I don't want to start working on something until I at least have a pretty good idea in my head of what that whole thing's going to look like. It's going to evolve and change as I write, but I can't kind of write. I can't even start in some sense until I have a pretty good idea in my head of what the argument is. And I think part of that, economists have the structure of economic theory too, aside from, particular books or particular theorists, right? You're always bound in by having to make an argument that works as far as theory goes. And so that constrains you in some ways.
Can I play devil's advocate here? Like, it sounds as if Sarah's type of work would keep the reader entertained for longer and would read a whole paper, whereas if people knew what you were going to write about, Steve, like you admitted yourself, you think, yeah, I've read that before, I'll skip the literature and I'll move on to whatever other new thing is emerging from your own thought process? Or does that happen at all? I'm sure it does, because I presented papers before and they just skip to the very end and look at the
right. Well, I mean, everybody reads the summary at the beginning and then the conclusions and checks to see if they're cited, right? I mean,
well, there's a famous, I think it was Bob Lucas, the Nobel Prize winner, somebody said to him one time, with econ papers, I read the introduction, the conclusion, and I just skip over all the math and see what's going on. And Lucas supposedly said something like, "Oh, that's funny. I do the opposite with him." Right? So what's your reader, right? And what does your reader want to do? So I don't know. I don't think it's, I think it's not, I think it's just more a difference. I think it's disciplinary, but I also think some of it is sort of our own approaches to writing. And I can't, so I was in this stage yesterday or the day before. I have this paper that I'm working on. I had a blank screen blank screen isn't true. I had about 600 words worth of, sort of thoughts. But I had to sit down and say, all right, I got to give myself some section headings in this thing. I got to think about, what the order of attack is for this argument and what do I, what material do I already have that I could write now? What do I, and in the case of that particular paper, there are some things I need to go back and reread and go forward and haven't read yet to sort of fill in parts of that paper too. So I think it's just, for me, it's like laying it all out and saying, all right, what does it look like? What do I have to do?
Right. We also have an occupational difference though, right? Since I'm not in a traditional academic job, it's great if I publish. Liberty Fund is delighted if I publish, but I'm not under any pressure to publish. So I have a lot more freedom to just sort of, go wandering blithely through the field, whatever.
Hans Christian Andersen approach, maybe like Little Red Riding Hood, and if you come across the big bad wolf.
Right.
Yeah.
What I
and so that frees me up to do the sort of quirky stuff that I really enjoy doing. I'm very fortunate that way. If I had a more traditional academic job, I suspect I would have, just by virtue of the need to produce on a more regular basis, I probably would have produced a much more sort of organized approach. And indeed, I suspect that if my approach were more like Steve's, I'd be a heck of a lot more productive, but I also think I might have less fun.
So I can see the advantages with two of them. Like Steve, you because you know your area, and even if the area is relatively new to you, you still want to find that structure. And by putting out those subheadings and having that structure or blueprint, it allows you to run with it and fill in those areas. And if you find that section 3 should be in section 1, it is difficult, and not trying to belittle it, because it is very difficult to put a piece of academic work together. And Sarah, yours is total opposite. You have your heading, you need to go down different paths, but there is structure when you look back and read it. Once you've find all it reads extremely well and really appeals to me the way it's written too, and something that's different. You're not under the pressure under any particular organization or academic discipline, so except maybe literature, and allows that creativity to explore. Allows you to explore your creative side.
Right, and so I mean, I just pulled up because you were. I think Steve and I actually probably end up, once I've sort of gotten through my chaotic, I have to read all of the things phase, which is where I currently am. I usually end up with sort of a solid paragraph at the top of the page. I just pulled the document that I'm working on right now. Solid paragraph at the top of the page, followed by an outline of the sections of the paper that are going to follow. Okay. I didn't know what they were when I started doing the reading all the things phase, but they've evolved as I've been reading. I think Steve is more likely to sort of say, if I'm going to answer this question, I'm going to need a section on X and then on Y and then on Z. Whereas I'm much more liable to say, I'm going to answer this question. Let me go see what I can find. Then it turns out that my sections are going to be X and Y and Z. Right? But we end up more or less in the same place.
And one of the ways when I teach this to students, right, when I spend a lot of time teaching first year students how to write research papers, one of the analogies I used to use, and it's ironic because I don't do it and she does, is like knitting a sweater, right? When you knit a sweater, you make it in pieces, and then you pull all the pieces, sew all the pieces together, right? And so I also said this, look, you need to think of this paper has sections to it, and they're like pieces of a larger thing that you're going to make, and the sections have to have their own integrity, right? And then part of what you do is get the transitions in there and make the connections and sew the thing all together. And the pattern you're looking at, right, is determined by what that thesis is, what that main line of argument is, right? And so that's how I still think about it. Another word here would be modular, right? I like to think about those sections as they're almost like mini papers of their own, right? That you're then having to make each of those arguments and then find the ways to create the transitions that tie them all together.
Right. And sometimes one of the nice things about that modular kind of thinking is that sometimes as you're writing, you think you have a writing problem. Like you think the paper's not working.
Yeah.
You think it's just like not coming together. And what it really is almost always, I find, is that it's not a writing problem. It's a structure problem, right? You have all the stuff that you need. You have the argument. You're just trying to make the argument in the wrong order. And if you move the section that's down at the bottom somewhere to the middle, then all of a sudden your paper snaps into focus.
And one of the other things we should mention too, right? I mean, we've been talking about writing academic papers, right? So we're thinking about that sort of, 20, 25, 30 page sort of typical academic paper. But other kinds of writing are different, right? I mean, I do a lot of, not so much now, but certainly when I was writing weekly or biweekly columns, right? That sort of 800 to 1200 word thing is a different thing. And the kind of long blog post 2,000 word thing is a different thing, right? For those, I'm much more, and it drives her nuts when I do this, right? Like I'll just open the laptop or sit down at the desk, and it's in, just boom, it's in my head. I don't even need an outline for that. That I can just 1,200 words I can do, asleep, right? I can do 1,200 words. Now, whether they're 1,200 good words is different, and that's where she comes in and looks at it and goes, those are 1,200 okay words. We can make them better. But
or sometimes, no, you can't.
Yeah, sometimes you can't write that. No, you can't. There's been a couple of those too. But that's a different, right? That's a different kind of thing. Or even the long, I wrote this long piece for the libertarianism.org thing at Cato recently. That was about 2,200 words, I think, right? And that was in my head, and that just came out. I just sat down and that comes out. I mean, you think of additional things as you're writing, but still, right? I think of those as shorter pieces, not everyone else would, but those are different, right? I think it's when you're dealing with a sort of formal traditional academic paper, I need to impose that structure on it.
And it's just from being, sorry.
Same kind of thing with those shorter pieces. Even though, again, I'm much more liable to want at least to have a couple of almost like hooks to hang the thing on, sort of figured out before, because often what I'm writing about is, isn't it weird you never thought about the insane connection between this thing over here and this other completely apparently unrelated thing way the heck over here. I want to kind of have those two things in place before I then explain to people why my crazy brain sees connections, right?
Thanks ever so much for continuing to listen to the podcast, and for all the new listeners to the show that have found me recently, thanks very much, and I hope we continue a great relationship heading into 2019. If you want to check out all these episodes and more, check out economicrockstar.com/podcasts, and you can find a full catalogue of all 170 previous episodes on that page. And if not, check out your favourite podcast platform and be sure to subscribe so that you'll always receive a notification and an instant download so you can listen to it on the go. Thanks again for listening, and I'll have part 2 out shortly. Economic Rockstar is a free podcast that does not exclude anyone from listening as long as they have a device to listen, download or stream. I have many listeners from all parts of the world, and I truly am pleased to know that the Economic Rockstar podcast unites all of you through the common theme of economics. I strive to commit to releasing an episode each week and aim to develop Economic Rockstar into much more than just a podcast. Patreon is a platform that gives you, the listener of the Economic Rockstar podcast, the opportunity to express your appreciation of the show by committing a financial reward for as little as $1 a month. Patreon allows me, the creator of the Economic Rockstar podcast, to be rewarded and paid by you so I can continue with the running costs of the show and to reinvest and expand the podcast into other platforms or mediums in the future. To find out more on how you can help the Economic Rockstar podcast and have your name added to the supporters list on my website, please check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/Economic Rockstar or visit the supporters page on the Economic Rockstar website. If you enjoyed this podcast, why not leave some feedback or comments on the show notes page on economicrockstar.com, where you can also sign up and be a member of the Economic Rockstar community. If you're listening to this episode on iTunes or Stitcher Radio, I would love to have some feedback and for you to leave an honest rating and review, as this will help with the rankings of the show so that more people can find it. If you're listening on the website economicrockstar.com, make sure you check out the back catalogue of all previous episodes and interviews with some amazing professors and authors at economicrockstar.com/podcasts. Thanks for listening, and I really appreciate your loyal support. I know how much you love audio, so why not get a free audiobook with Economic Rockstar today? I've teamed up with audiobooks.com to bring you this amazing offer. Visit audiobooks.com/rockstar to download your free audiobook now.